Hi, Professor Carol Boyce Davies. How are you? I am talking about Caribbean Worlds, which I will be teaching in the fall. It's a 2000 level class, but I put a lot into it because I think that this is probably going to be, for some of you, the only encounter you will have to things Caribbean, as close as the Caribbean is to the United States, right? However, we want to make sure that you have a really rich experience as you learn about any of the topics that we teach. So therefore, Caribbean Worlds is something that I enjoy as an expert on the Caribbean, and I claim it because I've been Caribbean Studies Association President 2015 to 2016. And also I've written a book, Caribbean Spaces, which we will definitely have a chance to read at least the introduction from. Okay, so what is this course about and how does it link to current events and opportunities? I'm sure you've heard a lot of discussion about global racism, right? So what we will do for sure is find a way to talk about how the Caribbean fits into that. And the Caribbean fits really solidly into global racism from its inception, from its origins. So the course therefore looks then at the arrival of the Columbus entourage and his various ships, the Nina Pinta Santa Maria they call, lands in Hispaniola, which he calls that, but before that the name the indigenous people call it was Land and High, Haiti. So this is the first place that Columbus arrives. And in fact, if you go to Haiti, there in the museum, you will still find the anchor from one of his ships. So the Caribbean then is central to the development of the Americas and the modern world system because it's through the destruction of indigenous peoples, the capturing of Caribbean land, therefore space, and therefore the bringing in of different communities of people that you begin to have the development, as described by Eric Williams in Capitalism and Slavery, of a capitalist economy based on enslaved labor. So we will study Caribbean space. In other words, we want to understand what the geography is. Not just the island space, of course, but the circum-Caribbean, and of course the Caribbean diasporas in England, in the United States, and various other places in the world. Definitely Europe, but also Australia. I went to Australia once and I was quite touched when Caribbean people were in the audience and came to talk to me afterwards because they were so happy to see somebody from that part of the world. So we will look at what happens then in history, how the indigenous peoples get not destroyed completely or wiped out completely, but really decimated by the arrival of Columbus. And not just Columbus, remember he takes indigenous people back with him to Spain to show them off technically, but also how the indigenous people were used for the expropriation of resources from the Caribbean, the sort of desire that the Europeans had to find gold and so on. And of course the ways in which they themselves fought back. One of the texts we look at is Anacaona Golden Flower, which is a recreation of that whole history of the indigenous encounter with the Europeans through the eyes of the queen of the indigenous people at that time, Anacaona, who is legendary in Haitian culture and history. Then we look at African enslavement and also not just the capture of Africans and their arrival in the Caribbean, but their resistance leading to the Haitian Revolution, which becomes the only successful revolution of enslaved Africans in the Americas because they were able to create a state, which of course they paid dearly for, also paying reparations back to France for a long time. We'll talk about that as well. Once slavery ended, and keep in mind, it doesn't end just like suddenly, right? In 1836 in the Caribbean, because they had a period of apprenticeship after slavery ends. But in the Francophone Caribbean, that was the English-speaking Caribbean, in the Francophone or the French-speaking Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and so on, it ends later. It ends like 1848. And even later in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. So what we say is that the entire century, 19th century, was taken up with emancipation of enslaved Africans. In the Anglophone Caribbean or English-speaking Caribbean, once slavery ended and Africans refused to work, they brought in indigenous people from India to work the sugarcane plantations. So keep in mind, sugarcane plantations have the same meaning, iconic meaning in terms of slavery as cotton fields do in the North American context. So we'll talk about that. In the middle of the class, I deliberately created a kind of break whereby students have been asked to study a Caribbean thinker, a creative person, somebody of significance who's contributed to the Caribbean in some notable way, and then to present, do a small presentation on them. Usually it's a group presentation, but generally it can be an individual presentation depending on the size of the class. In the group presentation then, for example, we had a group last time that did Walter Rodney. So to do Walter Rodney, they studied Burnham, who was the person who is accused of destroying Rodney. They studied Guyana. You know, you can't just do the person. You have to do, you know, situate them in their place. And the same thing with Haiti, if one were doing Haiti and the Haitian creative thinkers and contributors to knowledge of the world and knowledge of the Caribbean. So that's right in the middle, and students really enjoy doing that because they're allowed to uncover a lot of information that they are able to share with their colleagues, and also to become expert. For example, I had a student who, I told a story about a doctor I knew who never really paid attention to the kind of Caribbean historical information because he was so caught up with studying his sciences and so on. And then he went for an interview when he was about to do an internship, and they asked him about Frantz Fanon, and he had no idea. So when he came back home, he asked me, and it was my husband, asked me who is Fanon. So I told this story, and it was quite funny because I had a student who was going to medical school the next year. She said, I am going to do my work all on Fanon. And she did a magnificent presentation on Fanon because she uncovered everything about him as a medical doctor and so on. So Fanon was like a psychiatrist who studied the question of racism and colonial malaise and how people get towards self-hate, you know, that logic. You know, when you reach the point where you really hate yourself or you meet a black person who despises black people, that's what Fanon studied. He calls it the psychopathology of blackness. When you have a person who really feels like the psychopathology of the black man who is feeling that kind of enslavement. So we move from that, finally, after we do that really lovely interlude, to looking at Caribbean migrations. These migrations are the reasons why we have Caribbean people in many locations around the world. And therefore, along with that, the creation of carnivals, for example, the creation of places where you can buy Caribbean foodstuffs, the creation of community structures, all kinds of other relationships that come with migration. And whether it's England, where you have what is called the Windrush generation, or the migration of people going to Brooklyn and going to different locations. Miami is another good example of that Caribbean migration. And definitely Paris for the Francophone Caribbean, Guadeloupeans, Martinicans, Haitians, and so on. And we spend some time on Carnival, and then we end with reparations. And reparations is so relevant to contemporary times because the question of reparations for slavery and all of the after effects of enslavement is really fundamentally raised now in this post-COVID-19 period in which we live, following the recent uprisings and so on. Because you know, we begin, this is where I started, right? To talk about the question of global racism, that one of the manifestations of global racism is definitely in that inequity that one sees in who died from COVID-19, who was able to be self-quarantined and be able to protect him or herself and live. And of course, who were the essential workers and so on. And that question still remains. But of course, the questions of illnesses, the question of health conditions of people of color is really fundamental to that question of reparations. So it's not just reparations in terms of giving people money, but repairing the damage that has been done to black people because of enslavement, the historical oppression that they experienced after that period and up until the contemporary period. So reparations will be one of the places we will really spend some time giving you a good sense of how all of that works. So I look forward to seeing you in the fall. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the summer and that you are able to come back refreshed and able to really engage these really important questions that we plan to raise through Caribbean Worlds. Have a lovely day.